Mrs. Wilson had been teaching high school English for 15 years. By now, she could spot the different types of students within the first week of class. There were the ones who always raised their hands, the ones who made jokes, the ones who were popular, and the ones who seemed to be counting the minutes until the bell rang. And then there was Elijah. He sat in the back corner of room 237, his shoulders slightly hunched as if trying to take up as little space as possible. He wore the same gray hoodie most days, hood down in respect of school rules, but it still created a kind of shadow over his face. He wasn't unfriendly. He would smile politely if Mrs. Wilson greeted him directly. He wasn't a troublemaker either. His homework came in on time, neatly done but never outstanding. He was just quiet. In a class of 30 teenagers with bigger personalities and louder voices, it was easy for Mrs. Wilson to focus her attention elsewhere. There was Lily, who argued passionately about every book they read. There was Ben, who needed constant reminders to put his phone away. There were the twins in the front row who finished each other's sentences and made the whole class laugh. The first month of school flew by, and Mrs. Wilson settled into her routine. On this particular Tuesday, they were discussing To Kill a Mockingbird. The classroom hummed with energy as students debated Atticus Finch's choices. "I think he knew he couldn't win, but he had to try anyway," said Lily, leaning forward in her seat. "But what's the point of fighting battles you can't win?" asked Tyler from across the room. Mrs. Wilson noticed a small movement in the back corner. Elijah had shifted slightly in his seat, his eyes focused on the discussion. His hand twitched on his desk almost as if he might raise it, but then he seemed to think better of it and went still again. "Elijah," Mrs. Wilson called, surprising herself as much as him.
"Did you have something to add?"
The room went quiet. Several students turned in their seats to look at him, some appearing surprised as if just remembering he was there. Elijah blinked, then cleared his throat softly. I think sometimes you fight battles you can't win, because not fighting means something worse than losing." His voice was so quiet that Mrs. Wilson had to lean forward to hear him, but his words were clear and thoughtful. She nodded encouragingly. "That's an interesting perspective. Can you explain a bit more?" But Elijah just shrugged, his cheeks flushing slightly at being the center of attention. "That's all," he said, and his eyes dropped back to his book. The discussion moved on, and Mrs. Wilson made a mental note to try drawing him out more often. But as the days passed, that mental note got buried under lesson plans, grading papers, department meetings, and the daily chaos of teaching high school. One morning in mid-October, Mrs. Wilson arrived early to set up for a quiz. The hallways were still quiet, most students taking advantage of every possible minute before first bell. To her surprise, someone was already sitting outside her classroom door, back against the wall, a book open on his knees. "Good morning, Elijah," she said, fumbling for her keys. "You're here early." He stood up quickly, marking his place in his book. "Morning, Mrs. Wilson. My dad has early shifts this month, so he drops me off on his way to work." It was the most she'd heard him say at once. She noticed the book wasn't their current class reading, but something else, a worn paperback with a space scene on the cover. "What are you reading?" she asked, pushing open the door and flipping on the lights. "Oh, it's just an old science fiction book. My uncle gave it to me. It's about this school in space where they train kids to be commanders." His eyes lit up slightly as he talked about the book, his voice becoming a bit stronger. Mrs. Wilson found herself smiling. "Sounds interesting. Is this your favorite genre?" Elijah followed her into the classroom, still talking about the book. For those few minutes, the quietness fell away from him. He described the main character's struggles with surprising insight, drawing parallels to historical military strategies he'd learned in history class. The conversation ended when other students began filtering into the room, and Elijah retreated to his usual corner seat. Mrs. Wilson felt a small pang as she watched him withdraw again, like a turtle pulling back into its shell. During the next few weeks, she paid more attention to him. She noticed he was always reading, before class, during lunch in the library, according to the librarian, Mrs. Patel, and sometimes even walking down the hallway between periods with a book in front of his face. His essays, while not remarkable in length or flair, often contained observations that made Mrs. Wilson pause and think. When discussing symbolism in The Great Gatsby, most students picked up on the obvious green light, and the eyes of Dr. T.J. Eckelberg. Elijah's paper mentioned these but also pointed out the significance of the broken clock during Gatsby and Daisy's reunion, how Gatsby nearly knocked it over, trying to stop a time that had already passed. It wasn't the kind of analysis she expected from a high school sophomore. One day in November, Mrs. Wilson kept Elijah after class. He approached her desk cautiously as if worried he might be in trouble. "Is everything okay with my essay, Mrs. Wilson?" he asked, his voice dropping back to its usual quiet tone. "More than okay," she said. "I wanted to tell you that your insights are really exceptional, Elijah. You see things in these books that many students miss." He looked down, shuffling his feet. "I just write what I think. That's exactly what makes it valuable. Have you ever considered joining the school literary magazine? They could use someone with your perspective." He shook his head quickly. "I don't really like people reading my stuff." "But you turn in essays to me," Mrs. Wilson pointed out gently. "That's different. That's just school." He glanced at the clock. "I should get to math." Mrs. Wilson nodded, not wanting to push too hard. "Think about it, okay? And Elijah, I'd love to hear you speak up more in class discussions. Your classmates could benefit from your thoughts." He gave a non-committal shrug but offered a small smile before leaving. The following week, Mrs. Wilson introduced their next book, The Catcher in the Rye. As she handed out the copies, she noticed Elijah already had one, a personal copy with dog-eared pages and notes in the margins. "You've read this before?" she asked, pausing at his desk. He nodded. "3 times. Mrs. Wilson raised her eyebrows. "3 times! I think you might be our class expert then." Some of the other students looked over, curious about this exchange. Why would anyone read a school book 3 times? Ben called out, genuinely puzzled. Before Mrs. Wilson could respond, Elijah said, "Because it's different each time you read it." You notice new things. The simple confidence in his voice surprised everyone, including Mrs. Wilson. She smiled and continued passing out books, thinking that perhaps there was more to the quiet student than anyone realized. As winter approached and the days grew shorter, Mrs. Wilson noticed other small changes in Elijah. He would occasionally raise his hand during discussions now, though his comments remained brief. He started sitting a little straighter, a little more present in the room. One day she overheard him talking to Lily about her interpretation of a poem they were studying. His voice was still soft, but he was animated, using his hands to emphasize points about the poet's use of rhythm and how it reinforced the theme. Lily seemed surprised but engaged, nodding and arguing back good-naturedly. It was a small moment, but Mrs. Wilson felt an unexpected swell of pride. That afternoon, as students packed up to leave, Mrs. Wilson found a folded piece of paper on her desk. She opened it to find a poem, clearly original work, though unsigned. It was about a bird that sang only when it thought no one was listening, but whose song was carried on the wind to distant places. She looked up, scanning the room, but Elijah was already gone. Mrs. Wilson carefully placed the poem in her desk drawer, next to other treasured notes from students over the years. She thought about how easy it had been to overlook him at the beginning of the year, not out of malice or indifference, but simply because quiet students didn't demand attention the way others did. It was a reminder that sometimes the richest minds weren't the ones that announced themselves the loudest. What else was she missing by not looking more closely at the quiet corners of her classroom? As winter settled over Pine Ridge High School, bringing with it the first light dustings of snow, Mrs. Wilson began to notice more subtle signs of change in Elijah's behavior. It started with small things, moments so easy to miss that she might have overlooked them entirely if she hadn't been paying closer attention. The first change came in the form of his seating position. For months, Elijah had huddled in his back corner desk, almost as if trying to physically melt into the wall behind him. But as December approached, he moved his desk forward by just a few inches each day. The shift was so gradual that Mrs. Wilson only realized what was happening when, a week before winter break, she noticed he was now sitting fully aligned with the other students in his row, instead of half hidden in the corner's shadow. Then there was his participation. While still far from being a hand-raiser, Elijah had begun responding more readily when called upon. His answers, once barely audible whispers, now carried clearly to the front of the room. He still spoke with economy, using no more words than necessary, but the quality of what he said often left both Mrs. Wilson and his classmates thoughtful. During their unit on poetry, Mrs. Wilson had asked the class to analyze Robert Frost's The Road Not Taken. Most students gave the standard interpretation about choosing one's own path in life, but when she called on Elijah, he offered something different. "I think the poem is actually about how we create stories about our choices after we make them," he said, looking down at his open book. The speaker says the roads were really about the same, but at the end he knows he'll tell himself later that taking the less traveled one made all the difference. It's about how we need to believe our choices matter, even when maybe they don't. The classroom had gone quiet after that. Mrs. Wilson saw several students looking at their copies of the poem with renewed interest, and she felt that small thrill that teachers get when a student genuinely deepens everyone's understanding. Perhaps the most telling change was that Elijah had started staying after the final bell. Not every day and never for long, just a few minutes as he packed up his books with deliberate slowness, often lingering until most other students had left. At first, Mrs. Wilson thought he might be hoping to talk to her, but he rarely initiated conversation. He simply existed in the classroom space a little longer than necessary, as if testing how it felt to occupy it more fully. One particularly snowy afternoon in January, when most students rushed out quickly to catch buses or rides home, Elijah remained standing by the classroom bookshelf, running his fingers along the spines of the books. "Are you looking for something specific?" Mrs. Wilson asked, glancing up from the essay she was organizing. Elijah startled slightly as if he'd forgotten she was there. "Not really. Just seeing what's here." Mrs. Wilson put down her pen. "Those are mostly my personal copies, but you're welcome to borrow any that interest you." He pulled out a worn paperback edition of East of Eden. "You've read this a lot," he observed, noticing the creased spine and dog-eared pages. "It's one of my favorites," she admitted. "Steinbeck at his most ambitious. What's it about? Family, good and evil. The choices we make and whether we're doomed to repeat the patterns of those who came before us." She smiled. "It's not light reading, but it's worth the effort." Elijah turned the book over in his hands, then carefully placed it back on the shelf. "Maybe another time," he said, but Mrs. Wilson noticed him glancing back at it as he left the room. The next day, the book was gone from the shelf. She didn't mention it, and neither did Elijah. As January turned to February, Mrs. Wilson began assigning more creative writing projects rather than just analytical essays. Most students groaned at the assignments. Writing short stories or personal narratives felt harder to many of them than simply explaining what they thought a text meant. When she handed back the first of these creative assignments, she saved Elijah's for last. His story, a brief tale about a boy who could hear the thoughts of books but couldn't speak to tell anyone about this ability, was startlingly good. Not just good for a high school student, but good in a way that made Mrs. Wilson, who had harbored her own writing dreams once upon a time, feel a twinge of something like envy mixed with pride. "Could I talk to you about your story?" she asked him as class ended. He approached her desk with his usual caution. "Was something wrong with it?" "Quite the opposite," she said. "It's exceptional, Elijah. You have a gift for bringing readers into your world quickly. I felt like I knew your character after just a few paragraphs." He looked down, but she caught the slight upturn of his lips. "Thanks," he said simply. "Have you ever thought about being a writer? Not just for school, I mean." He shrugged one shoulder. "I write stuff sometimes. Just for myself." "What kind of stuff?" "Stories, I guess. Nothing important." Mrs. Wilson leaned forward slightly. "Would you ever want to share any of them? I'd love to read more of your work." For a moment she thought he might agree, but then he shook his head. "They're not really done. Maybe someday." She didn't push, but the next day she placed a notebook on his desk before class started, a simple black composition book, but with better quality paper than the standard school supplies. "I thought you might want somewhere special to keep your stories," she said casually, not making a big deal of it. Elijah ran his hand over the cover, then looked up with the most genuine smile she'd seen from him. "Thank you," he said, and the words carried weight beyond their simplicity. Throughout February and into March, Mrs. Wilson noticed Elijah writing in that notebook often, before class, after finishing assignments early, sometimes even during lunch in the library, according to Mrs. Patel, who mentioned it in passing in the teacher's lounge. That quiet boy in your fourth period English class practically lives in the library during lunch, Mrs. Patel said. Always writing in a black notebook. Is it for a project you assigned? Mrs. Wilson shook her head. Personal writing, I think. He's quite talented. Well, whatever it is, he's very dedicated. Barely looks up, even when the basketball boys come in and make a racket. This information pleased Mrs. Wilson in a way she couldn't quite explain. Teaching was always a balance between pushing students and giving them space to develop at their own pace. With Elijah, she felt she was walking that line carefully, encouraging without overwhelming him with attention that might make him retreat. In mid-March, the school held its annual Career Day, when local professionals came to speak about their jobs. One of the guests was Thomas Chen, a former student of Mrs. Wilson's who had gone on to become a moderately successful novelist. He had published 3 mystery novels and had come to speak about careers in writing and publishing. Mrs. Wilson made sure to tell her classes about his visit, mentioning that he would be in the library during fourth period, Elijah's class time, and interested students could attend. Instead of their regular class, you'll need to get a note from me and write a 1-page reflection about the presentation. If you choose to go, she explained. Several students immediately asked for notes, mostly those looking for any excuse to skip regular classwork. But Elijah wasn't among them. As the others filed out, he remained in his seat opening his copy of The Great Gatsby, which they were currently rereading for a different analytical approach. Mrs. Wilson felt a pang of disappointment. She had hoped he would take the opportunity to hear from a real writer. She considered encouraging him directly but hesitated, not wanting to single him out. 10 minutes into class, however, as she was explaining a worksheet to the remaining students, there was a soft knock at the door. When she opened it, Elijah stood in the hallway. I changed my mind, he said quietly. Could I still get a note for the writer talk? Mrs. Wilson tried not to show her delight too obviously. Of course, she said, quickly writing him a hall pass. I think you'll find Mr. Chen very interesting. Elijah nodded, carefully folding the note and placing it in his pocket. I finished East of Eden, he added, almost as an afterthought. Already? That's impressive. It's not a short book. It was good. You were right about it being worth the effort. He paused. I'll bring it back tomorrow. No rush. What did you think of the ending? A thoughtful look crossed his face. I liked the last word. Timshel. The idea that we can choose our path, that we're not trapped by fate or family history. He looked almost embarrassed at having said so much. Anyway, I should get to the library. Mrs. Wilson watched him walk down the hall, wondering what had changed his mind about attending the talk. The next day, Elijah stayed after class again, this time clearly intending to speak with her. He placed East of Eden carefully on her desk, alongside a folded piece of paper. I wrote down some questions I had about becoming a writer, he said. After hearing Mr. Chen yesterday, I thought maybe, if you have time sometime, you could help me with them. Mrs. Wilson unfolded the paper to find a neatly written list of practical questions. How do you know if your writing is good enough to publish? Do you need an agent? How do you find one? How much do writers typically make? Can you be a writer while having another job too? The questions were thoughtful and specific, not the vague wonderings of someone with a passing interest, but the practical concerns of someone seriously considering a path. I'd be happy to discuss these with you, she said. I'm not an expert like Mr. Chen, but I can share what I know. Would you like to talk during lunch tomorrow? He nodded, a certain determination in his eyes that she hadn't seen before. I'd like that. Their lunch meeting the next day lasted the full 45 minutes, with Elijah asking follow-up questions to each answer Mrs. Wilson gave. She shared what she knew about the publishing industry from her own research years ago, recommended a few books on writing craft, and suggested he consider submitting a piece to the school literary magazine as a first step. At this last suggestion, she saw the familiar hesitation return to his expression. The submissions are anonymous during the selection process, she assured him. Only the faculty advisor knows which pieces belong to which students until after they've been chosen. I'll think about it, he said, which Mrs. Wilson had come to recognize as his way of saying probably not, without directly refusing. As spring approached, bringing with it the pressure of standardized tests and the restlessness that always infected students as the school year waned, Mrs. Wilson noticed Elijah's black notebook growing more worn, its pages becoming filled with his neat handwriting. Sometimes during free reading periods, instead of opening a book, he would write, his pen moving steadily across the page. One day in early April, Mrs. Wilson announced their final project of the year, a creative interpretation of any work they had studied. Students could choose their format, a short film, a visual art piece, a performance, or a written work. This is your chance to engage with literature in whatever way speaks to you most, she explained. The only requirements are that it shows deep understanding of your chosen text and represents significant effort and creativity. As students began discussing their ideas with excitement, talking about videos they would make or paintings they would create, Mrs. Wilson made her way to Elijah's desk. Have you thought about what you might like to do? She asked. He looked up at her, a certain quiet confidence in his eyes that hadn't been there in September. I'd like to write something, he said. I have an idea, but it might be longer than a normal assignment. There's no page limit, she assured him. What are you thinking? I want to write a parallel story to The Great Gatsby, showing what happened from a different character's perspective. Maybe Jordan Baker's view of things, or even Myrtle Wilson's. Mrs. Wilson felt that teacher's thrill again, the one that came when a student truly engaged with material on a deeper level. That sounds fascinating, Elijah. I'm looking forward to reading it. As she walked back to her desk, she realized how far they had come from the beginning of the year, when Elijah had been just another quiet student at the back of the room, easy to overlook amid the louder personalities demanding attention. She hadn't known then what was brewing beneath his silent exterior, the thoughts, the ideas, the stories. She hadn't recognized the depth of his engagement with literature, hidden behind his reluctance to speak up. Now, watching him open his notebook and begin making notes for his final project, Mrs. Wilson wondered what other quiet students she might be underestimating, what other rich interior lives might be unfolding behind the silent facades in her classroom. And she wondered what Elijah might be capable of if he ever fully embraced the talent she was increasingly certain he possessed. The last weeks of April brought warmer days and the kind of restlessness that always infected students as summer approached. Windows stayed open in Mrs. Wilson's classroom, letting in both fresh air and the distant sounds of physical education classes on the field. Even the most dedicated students found their attention drifting toward the blue sky and sunshine. Everyone except Elijah. While other students were already mentally checking out for the year, he seemed to be diving deeper into his work. Mrs. Wilson noticed him carrying more books than usual, not just class readings, but novels and what looked like research materials. His black notebook had been joined by a second one, this one dark blue. Both were always close at hand, and he wrote in them whenever he had a spare moment. The final project she'd assigned, a creative interpretation of any work they had studied, had generated the usual mix of enthusiasm and groans from the class. Most students had settled on relatively simple ideas: posters, short videos filmed on phones, or brief spin-off stories. Standard fare for high school assignments, projects that could be completed in a weekend or two. But when Mrs. Wilson circulated around the room one day to check on everyone's progress, she found Elijah surrounded by notes and outlines. "How's your project coming along?" she asked, keeping her tone casual. He looked up, blinking as if returning from far away. "It's bigger than I thought it would be," he said. She glanced down at his notes. Pages of character sketches, plot points, setting details, and thematic elements were organized in a careful system that looked more like a professional writer's method than a typical student approach. "You're putting a lot of work into this," she observed. He nodded, a hint of worry crossing his face. "Is that okay?" The assignment didn't say how long it should be. "There's no limit," Mrs. Wilson assured him. "I'm impressed by how thorough you're being. Just make sure you can finish it by the deadline." "I will," he said with a quiet confidence that she had come to recognize. "I've been thinking about this for a while." As she moved on to the next student, Mrs. Wilson wondered exactly what Elijah was creating. His initial description, a retelling of The Great Gatsby from another character's perspective, had sounded like a typical creative assignment. But the extensive preparation suggested something more ambitious. The next day, she noticed him talking quietly with Lily near the classroom bookshelf after the bell rang. This itself was unusual. Though Elijah had become slightly more social over the year, he rarely initiated conversations with classmates. As Mrs. Wilson pretended to organize papers at her desk, she overheard fragments of their discussion. "Just wondering if you'd be willing to read part of it," Elijah was saying, his voice still soft but steadier than it had been months ago. Lily looked surprised but pleased. "Sure, I'd love to. Are you asking because of my English grade or because you actually want my opinion?" "Your opinion," Elijah said immediately. "You understand Fitzgerald's writing style better than anyone else in class. I wanted to see if you think my approach works." Mrs. Wilson hid a smile as she turned away. The quiet boy who had once been reluctant to share anything was now seeking feedback from a peer. It was a small step, but a significant one. Over the next week, Mrs. Wilson observed more subtle changes in Elijah's interactions. He spent one lunch period in the classroom with both Lily and Ben, the three of them huddled over pages of his manuscript, discussing something intently. When she walked by to check if they needed anything, they quickly assured her they were fine, with the secretive air of collaborators working on something special. "Everything going okay with your project?" she asked Elijah after school that day. "Yes," he said, gathering his books. Then, after a moment's hesitation, "I asked Lily and Ben to help me with some feedback. Lily's good at spotting when I'm being too obvious with symbolism, and Ben has good ideas about dialogue." "That's great," Mrs. Wilson said, genuinely pleased. Writing is often seen as a solitary activity, but many professional writers have trusted readers who give them feedback. Elijah nodded. "That's what Mr. Chen said at his talk, that his wife reads everything first, then his agent, then his editor. He said no one writes a good book completely alone." It was the most she'd heard about what he'd taken from the career day presentation, and Mrs. Wilson felt a small sense of validation that the experience had apparently resonated with him. As May arrived and the deadline for final projects approached, most students showed signs of last-minute scrambling. The usual request for extensions began, along with panicked questions about requirements and grading criteria. But Elijah continued his steady work, though he became increasingly protective of his manuscript, careful not to leave pages where others might see them. 3 days before projects were due, Mrs. Wilson found a college application brochure on the floor near Elijah's desk after class. It was for a prestigious university known for its creative writing program. She placed it on his desk the next day without comment, but with a small note attached. "Aim high. Mrs. W." When he saw it, he quickly slipped it into his backpack, but not before she caught the small smile that briefly lit up his face. On the day projects were due, students arrived carrying poster boards, USB drives, art supplies, and hastily printed papers. The classroom hummed with nervous energy as everyone prepared to submit their work. Elijah was one of the last to arrive, carrying what looked like a heavy stack of papers in a simple black binder. He placed it on her desk without fanfare, nodded once, and took his seat. Mrs. Wilson glanced at the cover page. "The Careless People, Jordan Baker's Gatsby." The title was elegant in its simplicity, but what caught her attention was the page count visible from the side of the binder. This wasn't the 5 or 10 pages she had expected. It looked more like, well, like a book. As the class period focused on beginning presentations, which would continue over the next week, Mrs. Wilson found her curiosity about Elijah's project growing. When the bell rang, she carefully placed the black binder in her tote bag to take home, along with several other projects she planned to review that evening. After dinner, she settled into her favorite reading chair, a cup of tea beside her, and opened Elijah's binder. The first page stated simply, "The Careless People, Jordan Baker's Gatsby, a novel by Elijah Reeves novel." Not short story, not essay, not creative interpretation. Novel. Mrs. Wilson felt a flutter of anticipation as she turned to the first chapter. What she read in the opening paragraphs made her sit up straighter. "The first time I saw Jay Gatsby, I recognized him as a fraud. It takes one to know one, after all, and I had been managing my own careful deceptions for years by then. We were alike, he and I, though he never knew it. Both of us inventing ourselves, both trapped in the stories we had created." This isn't his story. Nick Carraway already told that version, with all its romantic delusions intact. This is my story, and in it Gatsby isn't a tragic hero but a mirror, showing all of us the dangerous fantasy of reinvention that defined our reckless, glittering decade. The voice was perfect, capturing Jordan Baker's detached cynicism while adding depths that Fitzgerald had only hinted at. The prose was sophisticated yet accessible, showing an understanding of 1920s language without becoming a parody. Mrs. Wilson continued reading, intending to just skim a few pages, but found herself drawn completely into the narrative. Elijah had reimagined the entire Gatsby story from Jordan's perspective, filling in her backstory, explaining her friendship with Daisy, and providing her insider view of the events Nick Carraway had witnessed as an outsider. The story was remarkably nuanced. Jordan emerged as neither heroine nor villain, but a complex woman navigating a world that demanded specific performances from her. Her observations were cutting, her judgments of others often harsh but perceptive, and her view of Gatsby himself as a man both admirable and pathetic in his single-minded devotion to a dream added layers to the original story. Most impressive was how Elijah had maintained the themes of Fitzgerald's novel while shifting the perspective. The critique of the American dream, the emptiness of wealth, the carelessness of the privileged, all were present but seen through different eyes. When Mrs. Wilson finally looked up, it was past midnight. She had read over 150 pages without noticing the time passing, and there were still more pages to go. She sat back, stunned. This wasn't just good for a high school student, this was good, period. The kind of manuscript that, with some polishing, could genuinely be publishable. The kind of work that revealed not just talent but a deep, genuine understanding of literature and human nature, that went far beyond what she expected from even her best students. How had she missed this? How had she spent months seeing Elijah as simply the quiet student, when this level of ability had been present all along? The next morning, Mrs. Wilson arrived at school early, her mind still processing what she had read. She had finished Elijah's novel late into the night, unable to put it down until she had reached the beautifully crafted ending, where Jordan, unlike Nick, chose not to retreat from the world but to face it with a clearer understanding of its illusions. When Elijah entered the classroom before first bell, she motioned him over to her desk. "I read your novel last night," she said, watching his expression carefully. "All of it?" he asked, looking surprised. "Every word. I couldn't stop reading." She paused, choosing her next words with care. "Elijah, this is extraordinary work, far beyond what I expected for this assignment. Far beyond what I would expect from any high school student, to be honest." He looked down, but not before she caught the flush of pride on his face. "Thank you," he said quietly. "How long have you been working on this?" He shifted his weight from one foot to the other. "Since we first read The Great Gatsby in class. But I've been thinking about Jordan Baker for longer. She always seemed like she knew more than she was saying." "That's an insightful reading of her character," Mrs. Wilson said, "and you've developed it beautifully." She hesitated, then asked the question that had kept her awake part of the night. "Have you written other things like this? Other novels?" He nodded slowly. "A few. Nothing as good as this one, I think. This is the first one that feel finished." "A few," she repeated, trying to keep the astonishment from her voice. "Elijah, do you understand how unusual this is? Most people don't write multiple novels, especially not at your age." He shrugged one shoulder. "I just like doing it. It makes more sense to me than other things. Social interactions. The typical high school experiences." The statement illuminated so much about his quiet demeanor, his preference for books over conversation. "I'd like to talk more about your writing," Mrs. Wilson said. "About possibilities for it. Would that be okay?" For the first time in their conversation, Elijah looked directly at her, a cautious hope in his eyes. "What kind of possibilities?" "There are summer writing programs for talented young writers. Contests you could enter. And I have some connections with people in publishing, former students, friends in the industry. With your permission, I'd like to show your work to a few of them." The bell rang then, and other students began filing into the classroom. Elijah stepped back from her desk, but not before saying, "I'd like that." "Thank you, Mrs. Wilson." As he took his seat, she watched him with new eyes. The quiet student in the back row hadn't been silent because he had nothing to say. He had been silent because he was saying it all on the page. crafting worlds and voices with a skill that many adult writers would envy, and she had almost missed it entirely. The realization was both humbling and exciting. Humbling to think how easy it was to overlook the depths that existed in her students, especially the quiet ones. Exciting to consider what this might mean for Elijah's future. During the class period, as other students presented their projects, the posters and videos and short stories that represented genuine effort but not the extraordinary commitment Elijah had shown, Mrs. Wilson found herself watching him with a new awareness. He sat attentively, offering thoughtful comments when called upon, but otherwise remaining his usual quiet self. To look at him, no one would guess he had produced a work of such sophistication. He wasn't calling attention to himself or his achievement. He had simply done the work, poured his understanding and creativity onto the page, and submitted it without fanfare. After class, Mrs. Wilson sent a quick email to Thomas Chen, the author who had visited during career day. "I have a student with remarkable talent," she wrote. "Would you be willing to look at his work and offer some guidance about next steps?" The response came back within an hour. "Happy to help. Any student you're this excited about must be special." That afternoon, Mrs. Wilson approached Elijah again. "I heard from Mr. Chen," she said. "He's willing to read your novel and offer some professional perspective. Would that interest you?" The look on Elijah's face, a mixture of terror and elation, told her everything. "He's a real author," Elijah said, as if reminding himself who Thomas Chen was. "He gets paid to write books that people actually buy in stores." "Yes," Mrs. Wilson agreed, smiling, "and he was once a student sitting in this very classroom, thinking that being an author was something other people got to do. Not him." Elijah took a deep breath. "Okay," he said finally. "He can read it," but he hesitated. "Could you not tell the rest of the class about any of this?" "At least not yet." Mrs. Wilson nodded, understanding his desire to avoid becoming a spectacle. "Of course, this is your work, your journey. You get to decide how and when to share it." As Elijah left the classroom, Mrs. Wilson felt a strange mix of emotions. Pride in his achievement, excitement about the possibilities ahead of him, but also a lingering sense of wonder at how easily his talent might have gone unrecognized. How many other quiet students had passed through her classroom over the years, their gifts hidden beneath reserved exteriors? How many others might be sitting in her classes right now, their potential waiting to be discovered? She made a silent promise to herself to look more carefully, to find ways to create space for all students to reveal their unique abilities, not just the ones who readily put themselves forward. The quiet student had done something remarkable right under her nose, and she was determined not to miss such signs again. The weeks following Mrs. Wilson's discovery of Elijah's novel passed in a whirlwind of activity. With his permission, she had sent the manuscript to Thomas Chen, who read it over a weekend and responded with an email that began, "This is not high school work. This is the real thing." Chen had gone on to offer specific praise about Elijah's command of voice, his thematic depth, and his structural choices. He also included constructive criticism about pacing in the middle chapters and a few character consistency issues, professional feedback that treated the work with serious respect rather than the kind encouragement usually offered to young writers. Most importantly, Chen had asked if he could share the manuscript with his own literary agent, Alexandra Patel. "I rarely do this," he wrote, "because I don't want to be the person constantly sending my agent work that wastes her time. But this novel has something special. It needs polishing, certainly, but the bones of it are remarkably strong. With Alex's guidance, it could potentially find a home with a publisher." When Mrs. Wilson shared this email with Elijah, sitting beside him at her desk after school, she watched his face carefully. He read it 3 times, his expression shifting from disbelief to cautious hope. "He wants to show it to a real agent?" he asked finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "Yes," Mrs. Wilson confirmed, "but only if you're comfortable with that. This is your work, Elijah. You get to decide what happens with it." He was quiet for a long moment, looking down at the email again. "What if she hates it? Then you'll have received honest professional feedback from someone in the industry." "That's valuable too," Mrs. Wilson smiled gently. "But based on Thomas's response, I don't think that's likely to happen." Elijah nodded slowly. "Okay," he said. "He can show it to her." That conversation had been 2 weeks ago. Since then, Mrs. Wilson had watched Elijah navigate the strange dual reality of being both an ordinary high school sophomore and a young writer whose work was being considered by a New York literary agent. In class, nothing appeared to have changed. He still sat in the same seat, participated quietly but thoughtfully, and went about his school day like any other student. Only Mrs. Wilson and the two peers he had asked for feedback, Lily and Ben, knew about what was happening with his novel. But after school, Elijah would often stay in her classroom, working on revisions based on Thomas Chen's suggestions. Mrs. Wilson provided guidance when asked, but mostly gave him space to work through the process himself. She was continually impressed by his maturity in handling criticism and his clear understanding of his own artistic choices. Mr. Chen suggested I cut this whole section about Jordan's childhood, he said one afternoon, pointing to a chapter in his manuscript. He thinks it slows down the narrative too much, but I feel like it explains why she becomes the person she is later. What do you think is more important, the pacing or the character development? Mrs. Wilson asked, genuinely curious about his reasoning. Elijah considered this seriously. I think I can keep the character development but spread it out more, maybe as brief memories or conversations rather than a whole flashback chapter. That way the story keeps moving forward but we still understand her. Mrs. Wilson nodded, fighting back a smile. Many adult writers struggled with killing their darlings. Here was a 15-year-old analyzing his own work with the objectivity of a seasoned professional. On a Wednesday in late May, just as final exams were looming, Mrs. Wilson received an email from Thomas Chen with the subject line, "Great news, call me." She stepped into the hallway during her planning period to phone him. "Alex loves the manuscript," Chen told her without preamble. "She says it needs work. Developmental editing, tightening the middle, deepening a couple of the secondary characters, but she wants to represent Elijah and help him revise it for submission to publishers." Mrs. Wilson leaned against the wall, momentarily speechless. While she had believed in Elijah's talent, the speed at which things were progressing surprised even her. "That's remarkable," she managed finally. "It is," Chen agreed. "Look, we should be clear about expectations. This is still a long road. Most first novels don't sell, even with good agents, and Elijah's age could be either an advantage or a disadvantage depending on the publisher. But Alex doesn't take on projects she doesn't believe in. This is a real opportunity." "I understand," Mrs. Wilson said. "When should we tell him?" "Alex wants to set up a video call with him, and with you and his parents, given his age. Would that be possible to arrange?" "I'm sure it would. Let me talk to Elijah first, and then we can coordinate with his family." After hanging up, Mrs. Wilson sat at her desk, trying to process what was happening. In her 15 years of teaching, she had encountered talented students before. Some had gone on to study creative writing in college. A few had published stories or poems in literary journals, but none had attracted professional interest of this caliber while still in high school, and none of them had been as quiet, as unassuming as Elijah. She thought back to the beginning of the school year, when he had been just another face in her classroom, sitting silently in the back corner. How easy it would have been to let him pass through her class unremarked, his talent undiscovered. The thought sent a chill through her. When Elijah came to her classroom after the final bell, Mrs. Wilson could barely contain her excitement. She waited until the last students had filed out before sharing Thomas Chen's news. "The agent read your manuscript," she began, watching his face. She was very impressed. Elijah's eyes widened. "Really, really? In fact, she wants to represent you, to be your literary agent and help you revise the novel for submission to publishers." He sank into the nearest desk chair, looking stunned. I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything right now," Mrs. Wilson assured him. "This is big news to process. Ms. Patel would like to set up a video call with you to discuss the possibility, with me and your parents included." "Since you're a minor," Elijah nodded slowly, then looked up with an expression of sudden worry. "My parents don't know about any of this." Mrs. Wilson raised her eyebrows in surprise. "You haven't told them about your novel?" He shook his head. "They know I like to write, but not about this. It never seemed important enough to mention." The statement struck Mrs. Wilson as profoundly sad, that this tremendous achievement had seemed not important enough to share with his family. It offered a glimpse into Elijah's home life that made her heart ache a little. "Well, she said carefully. I think they'll be very proud when they find out. Would you like me to help explain the situation to them? Relief washed over his face. Would you? I don't know how to tell them that a real agent is interested in my book. It sounds made up. I'd be happy to. Should we call them now? 20 minutes later, after a phone conversation with Elijah's father that went from confused to astonished to cautiously excited, plans were made for the video call with Alexandra Patel for the following evening. Elijah's parents would come to the school, and they would use the conference room adjacent to the principal's office for privacy and better internet connection. As Elijah gathered his things to head home, he paused at the door. Mrs. Wilson, thank you for reading it, for taking it seriously. The simple gratitude in his voice moved her deeply. Thank you for writing something so worth reading, she replied. The next day passed in a blur of anticipation. Mrs. Wilson had informed the principal, Dr. Harris, about the situation, and he had been both supportive and impressed, offering the use of the conference room without hesitation. In 20 years in education, I've never heard of anything quite like this, he admitted. We should consider how to celebrate Elijah's achievement appropriately once things are more certain. He's very private, Mrs. Wilson cautioned. I don't think he'd want a big public announcement or anything like that. Dr. Harris nodded thoughtfully. Noted, but achievements of this caliber deserve recognition, even if it's more subtle. Let's see how things develop. At 5:30 that evening, they gathered in the conference room, Elijah looking both terrified and exhilarated, his parents still seeming slightly dazed by the turn of events. Mrs. Wilson and Dr. Harris, who had decided to join them briefly at the beginning of the call to show administrative support. When Alexandra Patel's face appeared on the screen, Mrs. Wilson was struck by how young she looked, probably in her early 30s, with a friendly smile that immediately put everyone at ease. After introductions, Dr. Harris excused himself, sensing that his presence might add unnecessary formality to the conversation. Once he had left, Ms. Patel dove right in. First, Elijah, I want to tell you how impressed I am with your novel, she began. The voice you've created for Jordan Baker is compelling and authentic. You've managed to honor Fitzgerald's original work while creating something entirely new and meaningful in its own right. That's no small feat. Elijah nodded, a flush of pride coloring his cheeks. Thank you, he said quietly. Now I should be clear about what representation means, Ms. Patel continued. If you decide you want to work with me, I'll help you revise and strengthen the manuscript for submission to publishers. That process could take several months. Then I'll submit it to editors at publishing houses who I think might be a good fit for your work. She went on to explain the realities of the publishing industry in clear, honest terms, the likelihood of rejection, the typical timeline, often a year or more from acceptance to publication, and the modest advances usually offered to debut authors. I don't want to discourage you, she said, but I believe in being transparent about this business. Publishing is tough and there are no guarantees. What I can promise is that I'll be your advocate and guide through the process. Throughout the explanation, Elijah listened intently, occasionally asking surprisingly sophisticated questions about the revision process, submission strategies, and contract terms. His parents remained mostly silent, though his father asked a few practical questions about how this might impact Elijah's schoolwork and college plans. Many of my clients balance writing with other careers and responsibilities, Ms. Patel assured them. We can work at a pace that makes sense for Elijah's situation. By the end of the hour-long call, the excitement in the room was palpable. Ms. Patel promised to send a formal representation agreement for them to review, and they scheduled another call for the following week to discuss specific revision plans. After the call ended, there was a moment of stunned silence before Elijah's mother turned to him with tears in her eyes. I had no idea, she said softly. All those hours in your room, I thought you were just doing homework or playing games or something. Elijah looked down, clearly uncomfortable with the attention. It's not a big deal, Mom. But it is, his father interjected, his voice gruff with emotion. It's a very big deal, son. As the family continued their conversation, Mrs. Wilson stepped out into the hallway to give them privacy. She found Dr. Harris waiting nearby, curious about the outcome.